ever start doing something fancy about intros, or do you guys go back and just some way chop it up? Or do they all start out, should we subtitle a program, Possum Stare at Camera? Well, see, I know, I've been around, I know at the big time stations they do all this crap, they count down, and so when it gets there, you're immediately playing like, yes, I'm always like this. You know? So these announcers that talk a lot, is my hair straight? As soon as they go 3, 2, 1, it goes, hello, now for the news. They don't fool me, I've been around those guys. Not socially. Are we ready? Oh, we're on. Jesus Christ, why didn't somebody tell me? As some of you may have heard, if you can't be offended, you can't be civilized. That is, you can't be civilized and held in your proper place. Which, off on another tangent, for which I don't think any of us have tickets tonight, you could say that's another definition of civilization, being held in your place, but then ordinarily civilized people don't get into some kind of damn ragtag discussion about, well, what is my proper place? You know, and I don't have time for that. And I'm sure you don't have any interest in it, being the uncivilized curs that you are. Not you people watching on TV, no. But you cannot be civilized if you cannot be offended. And a little more specifically, in your secondary factual sense of life and reality, if you cannot be offended by other facts, new facts, then your thinking cannot be properly held and stabilized in its proper position. All right, that is, I'll do it again, another way, that is, if you are indeed civilized, which we'll assume that all of you are, except for those of you seeing this in your cells and in the homes. But the rest of you, let's just assume in a kind of magnanimous sense that you are civilized. And if so, you're constantly being offended, but specifically in your thinking. I want to show you how life, in its devilishly clever manner, treats other aspects that appear not to be held to a factual matter. But right now, let's deal with what seems to be one's intellect. If you are civilized, you and everyone else, you are constantly being offended. Because you are constantly being offended, albeit probably not your immediate term, you're constantly being offended by the onslaught of what? Well, intellectually now. Insanity, wrong opinions, just to put it crudely, other opinions. What could be more offensive? What could be more offensive to a civilized man? Because a civilized man, part of what he has, besides a crease in his pants and a shine on his shoes, and with women, clean underwear, in case of you know what. If there's anything that a civilized man has, is what? The right attitude. That is, the proper facts, the correct opinions. That is being civilized in no sarcastic manner whatsoever. That is being civilized. To be civilized, taking that ephemeral, useful definition for a second, to be civilized in that way intellectually, to stay civilized, you are constantly being offended. Because you're offended, I guess we can skip possible other humor and just shave it down to a nub. You're being offended by every opinion, that is, every fact that is not in complete compliance with yours. You do not call it that. You call it insanity, dumbness, misplaced opinion, illogical loyalties. You call it all kinds of stuff, but it is what? It is offensive. You must be continually offended to be civilized. Put back as crudely as it came out initially on tonight's tape via Monsieur Kyroots, it just said, if you can't be offended, you can't be civilized. And what external examples are still extant on this planet through the auspices, at least the knowledge thereof, of National Geographic on PBS. And for those of you who do not have a TV set here, but you have it going down into your own spine, you know that you don't have to worry about certain obscure South Pacific islands. There are entities still on this planet that in a relatively speaking in a relative sense, are not civilized, not as civilized as you, and so they are less liable to be offended. Again, to shave it down real quick, the less civilized someone is, the less sophisticated, educated, hip, the harder it is to offend them. The less civilized they are, working on that gradual spectrum, it reaches a place of being almost an impossibility to offend them factually, such as we talked about another example under a different guise earlier this month. As important, as extremely important as it's taken the matter of illegitimacy and its effect on one's psychological, factual well-being, you pointed out to me, and I had to agree, that there are still people on this planet within the lifetime of great authorities, anthropologists, and other people who stick their nose where it seems to be a strange nose. There are people who even have no word for legitimacy or the lack thereof. Therefore, it's of no importance. So in that sense, if you went to a group of people now living, some of the areas of southeast Venezuela or certain parts of northwestern Arkansas, and you walked in and you just walked up to these natives and you says, "To me, you look like a bastard." They could not be offended. Even if you explain, well, that means someone whose parents weren't married. Now, of course, after people in Arkansas, you explain what marriage was, and they figured the whole thing out. You know, if it's not a family sport, they never heard of it. They could not be offended. Well, that's easy enough to see. That is crude, but again, I show you this is not just playing with words. It has a legitimate, tangible, physical reality out there in life that those who are less civilized, and remember, we're speaking factually. We're not speaking about walking up to some native that may not have a word for illegitimate and go up to him and slap him. You know, I'd watch that kind of crap. But to go up to a guy and you already have a grave suspicion, you walk in, you don't see in marriage chapels, everybody's walking around half naked, and you just get the feeling that their morals are somewhat looser than those at a Southern Baptist convention in Birmingham. Then you're probably safe to walk up to the guy and says, "Hi, I just got here. I bet your parents weren't married." And assuming you're speaking the language, the guy probably go that he's heard what marriage is or something. He goes, "No." You know, nice for you to ask. He is not. The point is, it's not offensive. Now, back from all of our wandering anthropological travels that probably were grossly unnecessary, back into here. There are parts of your nervous system, there are parts of your neural nervous system, laughingly referred to as your mind in some quarters, that is very easily offended. Not using those words, I'll grant you again. It is reactionary on an energetic basis, though, of being offended by misinformation, bad information, questionable opinions, all facts that are in some way conflicting with this is offensive. But into your nervous system, without you noting it, because it is now not serving the mainstream purposes of energy transfers, there are areas where you can't be offended, but you don't notice it in any sense that, well, I'm uncivilized there, because that which you do not notice at the ordinary level, you do not notice. So if they walk in, if you're staying at a bar minding your own business, and a guy who looks like the reincarnation of Billy the Kid sitting on the shoulders of Attila, and both of them heavily armed, and they walk in and say, "We," they speak in unison, they say, "We hate, we despise, we cannot tolerate all uncircumcised accountants." And let us say that you're a clean-cut, attorney. And let us say that, in fact, your sister married an accountant who ran off with part of your money one time on a business deal. In other words, you're not offended, but you don't really notice it, assuming that a stray shot doesn't hit you later when it comes down to armed conflict there within the bistro. That which does not offend you, you do not even notice, because as far as you're individually concerned, it is not a part of your civilizing process. It is simply part of the background noise. It is part of the flat on the stage. It's an act in which you have no particular interest. But other than that, you're being propped up by being offended factually. We'll get to apparent, actual-based offense. But on the factual basis, you are being propped up, you're being stabilized. The rudder of civilized, operational life in the secondary world is, in one real form, the continuing onslaught of offense. So if you cannot be offended, you would not be civilized. Back to a very crude, just to remind you that if we were talking about people barely literate, the nervous system barely wired and fired enough to talk, those people would be very hard factually to offend. And you know, without me going any further, you already assume what they would be just by ordinary definitions, not ours, we're taking everybody's. We're taking life's. They would be less civilized. The more civilized they get, the more ways there are to offend, the easier it is to defend. And when you reach the height, another interesting area that I'm not going into, but just generally speaking, when you hit the height, the zenith of being sophisticated, you're almost dealing with a milieu on which you must verbally, socially walk on little tippy toes as though you're on Fabergé little shells. What would be the height from one sense, from one view of ordinary reality, would be the court, in quotation marks, what that historically means. That would be, imagine King Louis. The height of civility, sophistication, all learning on the continent. We're speaking, of course, of the big 1-5 Louis. And there it is, you are in the bosom of civilization at that time, on the continent of Europe, which at that time everyone knew was much more civil than we were in Kentucky. Where, amongst all places in France, had you best watch your tongue, unless you would later like to watch it fall on the other side of Dr. Guillotine's fine invention? When you are in the midst, in the maelstrom of civilization, in one sense, there's a point past that I said was interesting, that some of you might want to fall over the edge yourself. But up to that point, right there at the height, the center of the civilized solar system at that time was the place that you had to watch it. Because the more civilized you are, even in the tangible external sense, the more civilized you are, the easier, the much easier, the more likely it is that you're going to offend someone. Now, forget Versailles and men wearing long, funny wigs. Except, of course, for any of you women who may be going with such a fellow. Then it's not my business. But now back, forget the wigs, forget the coverings, the innards. The very areas that people normally protect, using our kind of maps now, just for the night, just for the moment. The very areas that people protect, not through some insanity, not through some lack of vision, just in the ordinary sense of being civilized, educated, and blah, blah. The very areas that people protect, and for very good reason, but the areas that they protect are the places that is stabilizing them, that are stabilizing them to the point that an ordinary person cannot move. They're not supposed to move. If they move too much, they become unstable. They would begin to need to seek a psychiatrist or go back to church, or they become very upset and fidgety, and they bite their nails, and God knows what, and they borrow your books, and they fold the pages, the edges down, and they become just a total mess. But now to you, to somebody attempting to do something in a kind of radical neural sense on their own, the very things that would strike you, not from your own choosing, by now you should know, unless you're going to tell me what you're going to say next. But the very things that need defending are the very things that seem ill-appropriate to take an offensive comment thereto. Those are the things that a revolutionist would have to see, I have got to some way break out of. Not just literally and not visibly in the way in which you would invite somebody to insult your mother. Since many of you are looking blank, I'm trying to give you a crude example right quick. Now back to this, the very things. Now forget just defense of blood and kin. In here, the very things, the ideas that you would hold as dear as an ordinary man would, the name of his mother or his religion, the very ideas that seem to be, wait a minute, now I'll listen to people badmouth the Falcons, the Braves, my state, my country, my looks, but now wait a minute. When they say that, you can, if they'd gone through the little litany that I just did and sort of marked them off as though, well, I can accept a certain kind of verbal body blow in those areas. If they go through that man and say, but wait, then I can tell you what's coming next. No matter what they say, they've already absolutely define themselves as civilized, because the only thing left is going to be that they then start into their intellectual landscape, their thinking, because they say, well, now I am international, sophisticated enough, you're not going to get me all that upset by offending my religion, my home place. But if they go through all that, then the but is, wait a minute, if you're going to be extremely, and perhaps even purposefully, for whatever reason I don't know, stupid, ignorant, intellectually prejudicial, I'm not going to deal with this. The person is saying, I will be offended. Now, inside of you, those are the very thinking processes. Those are the very energetic patterns passing for human thought that are the most civilized, but they are coevally those most easily offended, and simultaneously those that people unknowingly, unwittingly, sans analyzation, will, under a feeling of being properly motivated, defend. That if you were sitting around with a group of intellectuals somewhere outside of a ballpark, and the conversation began to run the gamut, people got and begin, maybe they're having a few drinks, and the speaker makes some comment, and he puts down patriotism, and somebody puts down religion in general. And then somebody begins to badmouth science. And let's say you begin to get a little itchy. And then somebody gets up and says, wait a minute. And they begin to directly attack chemistry. Do you want me to put in the last part that the person I've just made up happens by trade and interest to be a chemist? Then a person gets what is normally called defensive. I'm saying they get to be a living example of being civilized, because they are now taking offense on factual matters, and they operate on the basis that by so defending it, so by being offended, whether they get up and actually defend it or not, but by being offended, it is a kind of self-help mechanism with themselves, because they know that their ideas are good. Yeah. They know that their ideas are correct, because let's say that it's one of the world's leading chemists. Yeah. Let's just say that. I accept it. That he knows as much about chemistry as anybody on this planet. And he is getting offended whether he says anything or not. And internally, what is he doing? he is being offended. But if you ask him, he might say, well, I'm not the sort to get up here if people are drinking or whatever they're saying. I'm not going to get up and make an ass of myself and perhaps rip the patches off of my elbow sleeves. But I'm going to tell you, and perhaps these people are just drunk, or perhaps they are not as intelligent as I thought when I entered this room. But yes, I'm offended. I'm offended by ignorance. Not personally, and they can go on about and sound as though they're a bright-eyed little bushy-tailed squirrel. Humanist squirrel. Intellectually humanist squirrel. Their offense is their own defense of what they already know. That is being civilized. Ordinary thinking must always find new ideas offensive. And it is thus that men stay civilized and stupid. Oh, I know it. All right, stupid as in, see, before you think I slipped up and actually made some kind of judicial, personal attack. Stupid in the sense of polarized intelligence. That's all I meant. I didn't mean stupid. I just used the word because I've heard it. And I knew what I meant. But stupid, you know, not stupid like in stupid or dumb, but stupid as in polarized intelligence. Even though, relatively speaking, that acts aren't offensive. That's what I was going to get into. That some of you might find, if not interesting, plenarily confusing. Even though, relatively speaking, acts cannot be offensive, would you care to note how life drives men to take serious social exception to certain meaningless, may I say, acts, so as again to distract ordinary intelligence, ordinary thinking, from perceiving the separate domains and functions of acts and facts. Is there any chance that you would care to give an example? Suspecting I would ask that, I prepared none. I will not be bullied. All right. You hadn't lost your place already. That insofar as what we've just been speaking of, insofar as we've been speaking of something, that people are ordinarily offended factually, and I even said that in a sense you cannot be offended otherwise. So relatively speaking, I still insist that relatively speaking to that, which has gone before on this tape, that acts cannot be offensive in that sense. But even having said that, I wanted you to note that life has driven, the more civilized you are, life has driven men to continually take serious exception to a wide range of social, and I'm, of course, already hinting, meaningless, in a wide sense, acts. But by so doing, it keeps people like, you know, here comes a tank about to run over your toe, and it says, oh, life hollers, look out, here comes a sparrow toward your head. Now for the example that you were so kind to request. Meaningless acts, you're going to have to figure out if we don't have time for me to try and pull it apart. But it's from a real, more primary basis, act basis, to call them meaningless. But I assume that some of you will see. There's no social commentary. But it's such as the civilized uproar over the use of the wrong salad fork. improper dress showing up at a formal function, an ill-timed belch during Mass. No offense to formal affairs, to religion, to fancy banquets, but from an actual basis. And I know, why bother to write me or anyone? Who wants to sit next to someone at a formal dinner when you dug out your best tuxedo or went and rented one for the big bucks, took a quick crash course or bought a book from Ms. Manners to learn how to do this, all dressed up, and they sit you next to a guy that's unwashed, wearing a tank top and flip-os, and he stinks and he scratches and he belches, and I could have, of course, said worse, but nobody wants to do that. I know all that. Insofar as a primary existence, insofar, still not discounting that. Nobody wants to do that. We'll take that as a given. Still, you surely by now understand that in one real sense, that is meaningless. Even those involved. In case you never thought about it, a real side trip right quick. But even at city level, at street level, those ordinarily, just ordinary people that are the most civilized, they would probably laugh or agree to this even easier, more readily, than if we grabbed a bricklayer, a post-hole digger out in a bar and says, I was reading a book and the guy said that all this stuff about having the right manners and using the right fork, and if they invite you to a formal fancy affair that you should actually dress accordingly and all that, and somebody pointed out that kind of stuff was meaningless. If you talk to him, or you went to one of the third generation Dodges or Fords or Rockefellers or Rothschilds, and you told them the same thing, I was just going to point out, not that either one of them understand anything in particular, but it's just part of this, may I suggest, beautiful arrangement, that the bricklayer would more readily disagree and say, well, I don't get invited to such as that, but insofar as the person would be interested enough to hear you and respond to it, may I suggest that that sort of person, less civilized in the widest sense, would be more likely to disagree and say, well, no, that kind of stuff, I don't get invited there, that's outside my social strata, but I can understand it. Because the person, if he was a thinking bricklayer at all, and don't write and give me, don't anybody send me another little paper with the word oxymoron, I know what it means. But assuming that he was a thinking carpenter, he might even to himself think, well, there is real validity to that. That's not just a laugh, because if me and a bunch of the guys get together to watch the games on Sunday, if one of the guys, somebody new moved in the neighborhood, and we say, hey, we all meet over at my house on Sunday, we have a few beers, we watch the game, come over, meet the guys. And if the guy showed up in a tuxedo with a bottle of white wine, well, it kind of makes everybody. So the bricklayer might go, if he was a thinking bricklayer, he might then say, well, to call those kind of social expectations, to call them meaningless is not true. Whereas, back to, God, what a side trip. If we went back and we spoke to the Queen of the Netherlands' son, or to the Queen herself, and got a few belts in her, and said, told her the same thing. We heard a guy pointing out all this stuff about, making rude body noises in the midst of a formal affair, or somebody making an important speech, or at Mass, or showing up with a wrong dress. That somebody said that was meaningless. May I suggest that those who would actually be involved with that, if you got me the right, they go, yeah, sure it is. Who the hell cares? They may remember, well, we remember one time that old Prince so-and-so, the pretender to the Albanian throne, I don't know, he'd been up 2 or 3 days driving up here, and we were having a party down in Luxembourg for somebody, and I think he was taking some kind of drugs, and he showed up, he came in, he said he thought that when we called him, that it was a masquerade ball, and there we were all formally dressed up, and we had, some of the Romanovs there, and it was a big thing, and he showed up dressed in an elephant suit. We all had a laugh and tried his half drunk, but they would treat it like, well, you're not supposed to do that, but what the hell? It's not the end of the world. Who the hell cares? In other words, they would give a kind of oblique tacit agreement that, yeah, it's meaningless. Back to the main subject. You understand that and I picked out, I admit, the kinds of examples. No, I don't admit it. I picked out examples that proved to be, to my surprise, somewhat laugh-producing in you people. But think, life is full of them. Would you care to say how full? All right? Real full. There is nothing like being specific. Real full. That life continually, now we're speaking the factual, we start speaking the factual level, but we're now to what would seem to be acts, such as making a rude noise, a rude body noise, right when the priest goes to bend over to light a candle or to wave a thing, and suddenly you're sitting up there and you make a very rude body noise from a part of your body that I'm not even going to go into. That would seem to be an act, correct? Let's say a belt so I don't end up and possibly let my tongue slip and say fork. It's an obscure psychological joke. Go check your clinical textbooks about a woman who had trouble eating in public. I just mangled it even further. Well, apparently it is an act. I mean, there's no doubt to go and make it's an act, right? To belch in the middle of a religious service or in the middle of the king's speech or just at a nice dinner party dressed up formally. It is no doubt an act, correct? And I'm not saying that anyone wants to be around somebody continually making those kinds of ill noises. But insofar as saying, well, that is an act, there's no doubt about that, and so don't say that acts are meaningless. What effect does it have on your continued existence, your well-being physically? Now, you may say, I'm offended because you're civilized. No offense. You may say, I'm offended, but what specific effect does someone else belching have upon your life? Now, if you said, well, it could ruin my life, then I don't have much to say to you further. Other than perhaps you'd like to be on that show of Believe It or Eat a Turnip. You might win. Because without it being a cheap shot, you do understand why I'm pointing out there are people that you might think that example was too crude, but there are people that would say, well, now wait, we're going to have to expand that for you to just dismiss other people's rudeness, other people's uncivilized behavior, and say, well, that has nothing to do with a good, reasonable person's life. To say it's meaningless is not true, because were a civilized person subjected continually to this kind of uncouth, feral behavior, it could have a what? God, here it comes. A negative psychological impact. And out in the city, they say that's true, and hey, who are we to say not so? So they could say that, but what I was also pointing out was if that's true with some people, which I have no doubt it is, because I hate to brag, but I know certain ways that life works. So if they say that's true, I'm going to say, okay. But I do not want to take a long bus trip with such people. Such people should not be listening to this. We'll assume that you're somewhat above a person with a bat wing and a brown paper sack and a